talents, and he would put those in the category of industry. William James made the same distinction. William James wrote a famous essay in 1907 called The Energies of Men, and William James, who arguably is the founder of American psychology, said that there are our talents and those things that unlock our talents, and we could design all of psychology to try to understand these two things. I would argue that we've done some amount of work on the talents and almost nothing on the unlocking. When I considered, what is it that unlocks people's potential? What enables people to become a world-class musician, a world-class teacher, a world-class performer? I struggled with this word to call what I was becoming to understand was one of these key ingredients. Eventually, I called it grit, which I named in part after the somewhat mediocre Western that John Wayne starred in. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But the reason why I came to this concept of grit was I interviewed people that I knew that were at the tops of their fields. So it was relatively opportunistic. I mean, I interviewed my friend who had won a MacArthur. I interviewed investment bankers who, at least at that time, were very successful. Interviewed musicians and professors and the like. And people would often say, the people who are the top in my field, they're the really talented ones. But just as often, and in fact, I would say more often, people said that these individuals at the top of their fields had this kind of tenacious, dogged perseverance, unlike anyone else that they knew, and it was actually that which vaulted them to the top. So I called it True Grit after this movie, which is really about a young girl from Yale County, Arkansas, who, like in typical Western form, her father is unjustly murdered. She spends the rest of the movie avenging his death, and Rooster Cogburn plays the one-eyed semi-alcoholic sheriff who follows her along. And everyone thinks the True Grit is really about John Wayne, of course, and it's really about this young girl who, against all odds, pursues a very long-term, almost impossible goal, and eventually, with the emphasis on eventually, succeeds in that goal. And this is the quality that I study. Charles Darwin had a half-cousin named Francis Galton, and they shared a correspondence. I like to think that correspondence today, is as rich and personally revealing as it was when you had to put a pen to paper. So maybe if they had emailed, they would have shared the same kinds of conversations. This conversation, this quote, this is actually the letter on the left and maybe a little more legible on the right, was Charles Darwin's response to Francis Galton, who had written a book called Hereditary Genius. Francis Galton made the claim that genius had three parts: one part talent, one part passion or zeal, and one part hard work. And Charles Darwin's response to that was, that's a really interesting idea. I thought it was all the hard work and the passion. Maybe there is a role for talent after all. Charles Darwin himself didn't actually consider his intellect to be at all special. He thought he had a quite ordinary mind, but a very specific interest and focus, and a lot of zeal and hard work. Moving up in a little closer to where we are in time, there was a graduate student at Stanford named Catherine Cox. She was the graduate student of a professor there named Louis Terman. He gave us possibly the most widely used intelligence test today, the Stanford Binet IQ test. So she was doing her graduate work in a lab where everybody studied intelligence and how to measure it, and was it possible to measure it very early in life, and could we predict genius and so forth. And Catherine took a very different take on her own research. She wanted to know what are these other qualities that make for genius, that make for realized genius, people who are actually going to do something in the world. So she read the biographies of 300 well-known geniuses, and she isolated a few qualities which really distinguish the geniuses who made a mark on the world. One of them was the tendency not to abandon tasks for mere changeability, in her words. In other words, not being a dilettante, not being a flake, not being me from the age of 22 to 32, right? Sort of, from one award to another, from one career to another, never actually setting sights on a port that I was going to consistently work towards, right? And I think we know many, many extremely bright people who don't have the capacity to stay on task towards one goal and keep switching from one to the other. I teach at Penn. I see hundreds and thousands of kids pass through Penn's, Ivy League portals, and they have this conception that essentially when they go off into the world, it will be an okay and good strategy